Hey guys, Lady Lee here from ladyleeshome.com, and I'm in the garden today. It's a beautiful, sunny, bright morning here in central North Carolina, and it is time to plant tomatoes. So I'm going to take you with me and show you how I do this. There's a certain way that we should plant tomatoes so they grow big and strong and produce a lot of fruit during the season. We're gonna go first over when to plant tomatoes. So we are at about the second week of May right now, and a lot of gardeners around me here in zone 7B do plant the tomatoes, at the end of April, some even in the second week of April. I choose to wait a little bit longer, about 2 weeks after the last frost date, just to make sure that I'm not going to lose any plants, because I did lose some plants in the past. You want day temperature to be in the 70s and night temperature to be preferably in the 50s. We still do have nights that we go down to the 40s, and that's fine. The tomatoes can handle it. I also have, I cover around the plants with some straw. So if I know that there's a really cold night coming, I'll just pile up the straw a little bit around the plants. But ideally, you do want night temperature to be in the 50s and day temperature to be in the 70s before you plant your tomatoes outside. Okay, now as far as the that tomato plant that you want to grow, this bed is going to be, the variety is called Jet Setters, and this is the first time that I'm growing them. They are a slicing tomato, and they're supposed to be medium size. I don't like generally to grow the really big varieties because I find that I don't get too many tomatoes per plant. So my garden is relatively small and I want to get as much fruit as I can. So I choose varieties with a little bit smaller tomatoes. These are not really small tomatoes, but they're kind of medium. You want the stem of the tomatoes to be about a pencil thickness, same as pencil thickness, and you want to find, if you're not starting them yourself, you want to find a tomato plant that is pretty long. What we're going to do is we're going to cut these lower leaves and we're going to plant tomatoes deep that only the top of it is sticking out of the ground. If you look at the tomato stem, you'll see little tiny hairs all over, and these hairs will become roots, and they'll hold the plant good, and there'll be a good root system, a strong root system. We're still going to support these tomatoes because they are indeterminate tomatoes. But still, we do want a good root system. So we're planting a tomato as deep as we can. Only the top is going to stick out. You have to make sure what variety you're planting. So there are indeterminate tomatoes and determinate tomatoes. Determinate tomatoes don't need a trellis. Indeterminate tomatoes do need a trellis. I think that even the determinate tomatoes, usually they do need some sort of support, but it can be just a simple low cage or a stake in the ground or something like that. Indeterminate tomatoes are the tomatoes that grow up. They're the viney tomatoes, and they can go up to even 10 feet high. So we are going to need a trellis to support them, and I'll show you in a minute what kind of trellis I'm using. But before you start, you have to know what kind of tomatoes you're going to grow, because it's easier to prepare the trellis before planting day. I started these tomato seedlings indoors from seed, and I have a video here on YouTube on how to do that. So I will link to it below or above, and you can go and watch that. But once you have your tomato seedling, if you buy it at the store or if you grow it yourself, once you have it and it's ready to go, make sure that your bed is amended with as much compost as you can afford. Tomatoes are what we call heavy feeders, and they need really, really good soil. They won't do very well in poor soil. So as much compost and organic matter as you can add is good, will be good for the tomatoes. The next step is to build your trellis, and let me show you what kind of trellis I'm using. I love this design. It's very simple, and I love that these are materials that can be easily found in any farm supply or hardware store, and they last forever. I can reuse them for something else if I need fences in the future or whatever else. I start with 7 feet T-posts. 1 foot is pounded into the ground. On the top of the T-post, I put a 1 1/4 inch PVC T, and that holds the rebar that goes, the 10-foot rebar that goes in between the 2 T-posts. If you have really heavy plants, you can put 3 T-posts. So if the rebar is 10 feet, you can do every 5 feet, and then you have 1 rebar in the middle. I find that since I prune my tomatoes during the growing season, the plants don't get too heavy. And usually if I put 1 T-post at the end of each rebar, that's fine. You'll see in a minute how this trellis holds the tomatoes throughout the season. There's also a blog post on the blog with all the details of the trellis and the materials and how I build it. Another great thing that I love about this trellis is that I can change from the strings that hold the tomatoes to this netting, and then I can grow beans on it, or peas like you see behind me, and cucumbers and any other plants that I want. So basically, once I put it on a bed, it stays there, and then I can still rotate the plants, and there are plenty of plants that I can use that bed for with the trellis being there. Before we start, let me show you how all this looks once it's done. You can see in this bed that the tomatoes are planted pretty deep, and only the top is showing up. Next to every tomato there's a stake that holds the string, or I tie the string to it and then up to the rebar of the trellis. And as the tomato plants grow through the season, I make sure to prune it and wrap it around the string, and that's basically how this trellis holds the tomatoes. The first thing that I do is remove the mulch from the bed. I'm going to use a post hole digger to dig a big, and deep hole for the tomato so we can plant it deep. I also remove the rebar because it's easier to work with the post hole digger if there's no rebar hanging above you. Next, I'm taking my plants and just putting them wherever I want to plant them so I can see how many I have and how many I can fit. I need to cut. I'm going to cut the lower leaves, and then we'll plant the tomato all the way deep like that. So I am planting my tomatoes about 18 inches apart from each other. I'll just place them here so I can have a better idea of what I'm doing before I start digging. Okay. Now that everything is in place, I'm going to move these seedling aside and dig a hole with the post hole digger. Okay, that should be deep enough. I'm going to add about 3/4 of a cup of lime to each hole. because it adds some calcium and that prevents blossom end rot for the tomatoes. I usually add about half a cup of worm castings too, but I don't have worm castings, so I'll just make sure to fertilize my tomatoes really well as they grow with, I use fish fertilizer, fish emulsion, whatever you call it. Anyways, so those are the two things that I usually put in the planting hole. I'll take my plant and put it down here. Then I'll take my stake and put that in the hole too. And now I'm just covering and filling the hole with the soil. Now I'm going to keep on going. I'm going to plant the other 4 plants that I have here, and when they are all planted this way, then we'll put the rebar back and put the string on each tomato. All of the tomatoes are in the ground. I replaced the rebar and I tied the string to the bar up there, right above the tomato seedling. And now all I gotta do is tie it over to the stake. I tried in the past to tie it to the actual plant, but it's okay with some plants, but then some plants, it damages them. So I don't do that anymore. I just tie it directly to the stake. You can also get bamboo stakes, like I think at Lowe's or something like that. And that's it. That is where this plant is going to climb as it grows. I'll just wrap it through the string, and once it gets all the way to the top, I will cut the top of it, and then all the energy will go back to the plant, and the plant will be able to focus on fruit production. So I'm going to do this with all of those, and then the last step is to take the mulch and cover around the plants again. That is it, guys. This row is planted and I have a couple more to go, so that's what I'm gonna go and do right now. Make sure that you water your plants in very well and that you kind of baby them and watch over them in the first couple of weeks until they really get hold and start growing. And keep an eye on the weather. If they need to be covered with some straw or maybe a greenhouse plastic or something like that, then do that. Tomatoes can't handle the cold, so again, like I said in the beginning, I usually wait about 2 weeks after the last frost date, but I still, even at this time, need to kind of watch what's going on with the weather and all that. I hope this was helpful. Again, there is a blog post on the blog for how to plant tomatoes too. So I'll link to all of that information in the notes below. And that's it. I'll see you in the next video. Please like and subscribe and go plant some tomatoes.